Welcome to the program. I'm Roby Brock. We are glad to have you with us. We are joined today by Tom Cotton. He is the state's junior senator from the state of Arkansas here. I got to remind you, you're the junior senator behind Senator John Bozeman,
the junior senator and the youngest senator.
Just so you can respect your elders.
I respect Senator Bozeman immensely.
Welcome to the program. Good to have you back.
Good to be back, Roby.
All right. You've been doing well. You were on a submarine, you were telling me there for a little bit.
Yeah, about 3
You're
weeks.
a tall guy to be on a submarine.
It's pretty short ceilings and pretty tight quarters on the bunks there. But yeah, 3 weeks ago I went up with the Navy to be part of their semi-annual ice exercise where they conduct submarine operations under the Arctic ice. So I got to spend about 18 hours underneath the Arctic ice cap and then surface through the ice. It was a balmy -20 when we surfaced.
Ah, well, see, and then you come back to Arkansas in April, and you could experience maybe a snowstorm or something like that, or a tornado. We never know which way it's going in Arkansas. Let's focus on some serious affairs here. We have seen over the last couple of weeks a lot of activity between the U.S. and Russia. Everything from the nerve gas attack on British soil and how the U.S. and its allies have responded to Vladimir Putin and Russia on that. Obviously, we have been dealing for months with this evidence of Russia meddling in U.S. affairs, retaliation back and forth. You've got the conflict in Syria. And there are reports that President Trump wants to invite Vladimir Putin for an official visit to the White House. Is that the right message to send with all of this U.S.-Russia conflict?
Well, first, let me distinguish between the U.S.-Russia relationship and the relationship between our two leaders. It's fair to say that the U.S.-Russia relationship is as tense as it's been since 1983, 1984, in part because Russia continues to engage in the kind of actions you just described, hacking into those emails and releasing them during our election, intervening in the Syrian civil war contrary to our interests, continuing to probe on our European allies' borders, doing things like using a highly toxic chemical to try to assassinate a former Russian spy on British soil. We've taken much stronger steps in the last 15 months against Russia to try to impose new boundaries on Vladimir Putin's behavior than we had in the previous 8 years. And we should continue to do those things, like expelling spies that we know to be here on our soil.
You think those things are part of what is causing the relations to be even frostier?
No, what's causing relations to be frosty is what Russia is doing. We're not using chemical weapons against Russians. We're not trying to undermine their interests in the Syrian civil war. We're trying to bring about a peaceful resolution. We're not the ones that invaded European countries. It's Russia's actions that are causing this low point in our relationship. All that said, our president, whoever he may be at any given time, has to maintain a relationship with the leaders of other great powers. So just because Vladimir Putin is a dictator or Xi Jinping in China is a dictator, they have to maintain an open line of communication, as our presidents did throughout the Cold War. To go back to 1983, Ronald Reagan, even at that low point, continued to try to communicate with Soviet leaders. Now, he joked that they kept dying on him in his early years in office. It wasn't until Mikhail Gorbachev came into office that he found someone in which he had an open dialogue and could have conversations about trying to reduce tensions. Now, that didn't mean that they always got along or that they always reached an agreement. He famously walked out of the Reykjavik summit in 1986 when Mikhail Gorbachev proposed to reduce nuclear weapons significantly only if we surrendered missile defense. And I think that's what President Trump is trying to get across when he talks to Vladimir Putin or when he talks about sitting down to meet with them, is even when relations are low, maybe especially when relations are at a low point with other great powers, it's important that our leaders have an open line of communication.
You'd be okay with a state visit, though, to the White House?
I wouldn't have a state visit. A state visit is something very particular. So President Macron of France is coming in for a state visit. There'll be a formal state dinner. The Old Guard, my old unit, will be conducting an arrival ceremony at the White House. There'll be an address to the joint session of Congress. But no, I wouldn't object to the kind of face-to-face meeting that the president apparently proposed. I don't know what they talked about. Just like I think the president has at least some chance of success next month when he sits down with Kim Jong-un to try to achieve our objective, which is the peaceful denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Again, that's an example of how even when relations between our nation and an enemy are at a low point, it's still important for our leader to have open line of communication with that country's leader.
This president seems to do things a little differently than previous presidents in terms of national and international security matters there. And we've seen some change in leadership in some of the national security positions. McMaster out, Bolton in. You mentioned before we started rolling, there's going to be a couple of confirmation hearings that'll be coming up. So I guess my question to you is, what's going to be different with these people in these new positions? How do you think it is going to pivot from the way we conducted foreign affairs under General McMaster and others?
So I think the biggest change you'll see is at the State Department. This is, again, to go back to the Reagan era, I would liken this to President Reagan and Secretary of State Alexander Haig, who had been a very distinguished career military officer, a general officer, in the same way that Rex Tillerson had a very distinguished career at ExxonMobil.
Right.
Sometimes these relationships between a president and a secretary of state just don't work out the way they might seem to at the beginning. Just like General Haig departed after about 15 or 16 months for President Reagan. Secretary Tillerson has departed now. I think Mike Pompeo, whom I know very well, one of my closest friends when we served in the House of Representatives together, is, as the president has said, on the same wavelength. So the president's going to have a Secretary of State who is more in tune with his line of thinking. That doesn't mean they're always going to agree, but Mike Pompeo is going to remember who the president is and who the Secretary of State is.
John Bolton, though, a little bit of a bombastic figure in circles there. What does he bring as National Security Advisor?
Ambassador Bolton understands how to make the levers of power in Washington move. And he understands, too, that the National Security Advisor advises, the president decides. So it's his job to kind of synthesize all of the counsel the president gets from the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the CIA Director, so on and so forth, that he has the information he needs to make a decision, that proper courses of action are lined up for him so he can make a reasoned decision, and then, as important, that the national security bureaucracy is implementing the president's decision. Ambassador Bolton has been in numerous positions in government over his 30 years in Washington, and he knows how to make things happen for the president.
Do you feel better about this national security team than the previous national security team?
I wouldn't say better or worse, I would just say different. I think General McMaster, who I also know very well, is exactly what the president needed last year when he came into office. He's someone who'd never held high public office before, the first time that's ever been the case in our country. General McMaster helped get him off on the right foot. He helped stand up the National Security Council, helped write the national security strategy that comes out in a new president's first year. I think it was time for him to make a decision about moving on, and I know that he and the president, talked extensively about this decision, and they mutually agreed that now is the right time, before the president sits down with Kim Jong-un next month, before he reaches the next decision about the Iran nuclear deal. That's why I hope the Senate will also confirm Mike Pompeo and Gina Haspel to be the CIA director in April before those things happen.
Who do you hope is going to be there by the president's side with the North Korean leader?
I would expect Mike Pompeo will be there, both as his current role as CIA director or in his future role as Secretary of State.
You worried about any kind of appeasement?
I'm not. So far, the president has said exactly what you would want him to say from my standpoint, which is it's fine to sit down and talk. North Korea is no longer an aspiring nuclear power. It's a nuclear power. That's obvious for the whole world to see. The patterns of crises between the United States and North Korea also have been very common over the last 30 years. This may be a chance to get out of that pattern being North Korea pushes us to the point of crisis, we offer them concessions in terms of food aid or relaxed sanctions just to sit down and talk, and then they walk away from the negotiating table. This president said he's willing to talk, but he's not willing to grant concessions just for the sake of talking. And I don't believe that he will, nor should we, offer concessions that are one-sided or disproportionate to what North Korea would offer, which ultimately is the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
Let's pull it back to domestic crisis here, and this is the opioid crisis. You and Attorney General Leslie Rutledge held a press conference on Wednesday to talk about some plans that you have to collaborate on that. First of all, tell me what you guys are planning on doing.
So the opioid crisis is reaching epidemic proportions across our country. It's very dangerous here in Arkansas as well. 60,000 people a year are dying from opioids. That's prescription painkillers, heroin, fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid. That's more people dying every single year than died in the entire 2 decades of the Vietnam War. We've got to put a stop to it. Attorney General Rutledge is trying to crack down on some of the manufacturers of prescription painkillers and some practices in which they've engaged. In Washington, I'm trying to crack down on fentanyl dealers. Again, fentanyl has legitimate pain management purposes. Physicians have used it for a long time. It's only in the last few years that it's begun to show up on the streets, coming frequently from China, and it's so dangerous. It's so dangerous that mere exposure to it has almost killed law enforcement officers around the country. But the sentencing guidelines don't reflect that fact. They don't reflect the fact that it's gone from pain management clinics out onto the street. So I've proposed legislation that would substantially increase mandatory minimum sentences for anyone who's using fentanyl.
And the AG supports you on that. But we just learned this week 2 studies, legitimate medical studies have come out that suggest that medical marijuana could be something that helps stem this opioid crisis because it can be used as a pain reliever and some of that. We obviously have our problems implementing medical marijuana here in Arkansas. They're well chronicled. I know you're aware of that. Should we do more at the federal level to explore this medical marijuana? It seems to be a growing trend. States like Arkansas are now supportive of it, but we've got federal laws that prohibit marijuana usage in many ways. Is it time for Congress? Is it time for the Senate to deal with this?
I think right now what we're seeing across the states is exactly what our federalist system is designed to do, to allow the states to experiment and see what may work and what doesn't work. I think there's a pretty sharp difference in the minds of most Arkansans, to include those who voted for the medical marijuana amendment, between medical marijuana and commercializing marijuana, to legalize it as a drug and then turn it into a highly profitable, lucrative business in which you can buy marijuana for any reason on every street corner. There's a big difference in that, and Arkansans have only been willing to take the first step. I don't think we should, in Congress, change the laws that would essentially not just decriminalize or even legalize marijuana, but allow it to be commercialized because of all the negative side effects that would have.
But what about on the medical front, though? Do you think it is time for Congress to maybe act on the medical front in terms of marijuana?
So the Attorney General has announced that each individual U.S. attorney will have the discretion to apply the federal laws in their state based on their state laws. So I don't anticipate the Department of Justice will take steps to interfere with states like Arkansas. They've taken the somewhat modest restrained step of adopting a medical marijuana program that is going to be very tightly regulated. Now, for those states that have essentially not just legalized marijuana or commercialized it, I can't speak to what's going to happen in those states. I think that would be an unwise step to take for Arkansas's kids and families and communities, and most Arkansans haven't been willing to take that step.
It doesn't sound like you're going to lead the charge, though, in Congress on making medical marijuana maybe more widespread in other states, or finding ways for the federal laws to comply with it in a way to address this opioid crisis.
It's a state decision, which is the decision that the people of Arkansas made in a referendum a couple years ago. But also there's a real difference between saying an adult who is addicted to opioids or maybe has advanced cancer and wants to use marijuana for pain management. That's a very different decision from saying we're going to commercialize marijuana and make it easily available to teenagers, where the science shows it can have very detrimental effects on that. And I do worry about that impact on our communities.
You are supportive of the scenario A, though.
Scenario A.
That you just outlined right there, that a cancer patient uses it for pain treatment.
I respect the decision that the voters of Arkansas have made. It's not my responsibility to implement that at the state level. I trust the governor and the legislature and our state agencies will implement it, though, in a responsible fashion.
Last question for you. What's on the congressional calendar the rest of this year? It is an election year. We're already knee-deep in the primary season. A lot of times things don't get done in Congress during election years. What do you anticipate will be some of the big action items between now and November?
Well, in the Senate, we're in the personnel business as well, especially every 8 years when we have a new president. Unfortunately, a lot of Senate Democrats have really dug in their heels when it comes to confirming the president's nominees as well as confirming the presidential's judicial nominees. So just in the coming month, I hope that we confirm Mike Pompeo to be the Secretary of State and Gina Haspel to be Director of the CIA. Admiral Jackson will be up in front of the Senate to be the new Secretary of the VA. And we still have hundreds of sub-cabinet nominees in addition to judicial nominations. And that makes a real difference for Arkansans. We've already confirmed 2 new judges to the Court of Appeals that covers Arkansas. We'll have an opening here in the Eastern District of Arkansas as well. I hope that we can fill that slot too. And then moving forward, in addition to those nominations that we have to confirm in the Senate, I think we'll pass a banking bill that'll give some relief to our community banks, which is going to be good for people all across Arkansas if they need a loan for their small business or a mortgage or a car. I hope that we'll pass an opioids bill as well that will include my legislation to crack down on fentanyl dealers.
Nothing big on immigration, nothing big on...
We had an immigration debate.
We've had a big talk about it. Nothing big on health care.
We had a big immigration debate in February. Democrats dug in their heels. They filibustered what I thought was a very reasonable proposal to both protect our border and stop extended family chain migration in return for giving legal status to young people who were brought here before they turned 18. They turned that down. There might be some negotiations later this year in terms of trying to build the southern border wall in return for some protections for a smaller class of those people who have registered with the federal government and gotten a work permit. Right. But I don't see major immigration legislation passing the rest of this year because we had that debate and the Democrats squandered their opportunity.
Y'all are done with health care and taxes this year too? Infrastructure, any of that stuff?
Well,
I mean,
you're never quite done with health care and taxes because it's such an important topic for all Arkansans, for all Americans. But I don't anticipate major legislation since we just passed the biggest piece of tax reform legislation in 30 years back in December.
All right. He's Senator Tom Cotton. As always, good to visit with you. Thanks for being in
Appreciate
studio.
it.
Good to get you face to face. Glad you didn't get stuck in that submarine.